Oh, hello! And for those of you in the US, happy Thanksgiving. Today we are doing what has become kind of my Thanksgiving tradition, which is that I like to, on Thanksgiving, talk about things that I'm thankful for, namely my favorite books. Now, the last 2 years I've done like my top 10 favorite books of all time. And that was because the first time I did it, I had kind of one paradigm of how I was doing the video, like what could and couldn't be included in the video, versus the second time. And since then, I might change some of the rankings slightly, but I don't feel like it merits a full video of my new top 10 favorite books of all time because they haven't really changed, which makes sense because they're all-time favorites. They're pretty static overall. But in the comments of that video, several people like the idea of me trying to do an unranked top 50 video. So that is what we're going to do this year. These are my unranked top 50 books of all time. And this was really interesting to put together. I have some stats we're going to go over before I run through what these books are. I realized when I was coming up with my list, like I got to a list of 70, which I could fairly easily call down to a list of about 55. So there were roughly 5 books that like were on the bubble that didn't make it in. So this does make me wonder if next year maybe I'll do a top 100 because I think I could probably get to that. Let me know if that is something you guys are interested in. But I like having this as sort of like a really positive, happy yearly check-in on thinking through like what are my all-time favorite books. I also like to have this as something to kind of point people to in terms of if you're new to me or new to my channel, giving you a sense of the kind of books that I tend to really enjoy. I like having it here. It also makes me kind of want to do a copy of what Books and Lala did a few years ago with Lalathon, I think is what she called it, where basically she picked her favorite books and then like did rereads and everybody did like a readathon reading her favorites. This kind of makes me want to do that. I don't know if I have the will to organize that. But anyway, if you're ever curious as to some of my, more than just like my top 10 favorites, a broader pool of my all-time favorite books, this is what this video is. So with that being said, before we get into the list itself, I wanted to share some stats because I'm a stats nerd. I enjoy looking at data around my reading life. And in particular, I did a few different breakdowns that I thought would be interesting. So first of all, I was looking at genre-wise what the distribution was in terms of these 50 books. And it wasn't surprising to me to see that the top genre was what I would describe as like literary fiction, which I also kind of put classics into that bucket. But basically my takeaway from this is that it's literary fiction, then mystery thriller. So like in terms of an actual true genre, really mystery thriller was at the top for me. And then sci-fi fantasy. I think if I hadn't grouped SFF together, the next one would have been speculative romance, which is what I would think of as like urban fantasy with a romantic element, sci-fi romance with a romantic element, etc. And then also a good chunk of just general types of nonfiction. So I guess I wasn't surprised to see the breakdown, but it was interesting to me. Speaking of nonfiction and fiction, it does look like 18% were nonfiction, but the other 82% of these books were all fiction picks. And then another interesting genre element was that I noticed that there was, it felt like a lot of romance and a lot of like speculativeness. And that is true. If you group all of the different types of romance together, they constitute 26% of my favorites. And then if you only look at books with speculative elements, that also constitutes 26% of my favorites. So I often say that my favorite kind of book has a mystery plot engine, a strong romantic element set in some kind of speculative world. And I think you can literally see that reflected in sort of the different genre stats that I was looking at. So it was sort of gratifying to see that sort of feeling I have borne out in the numbers. And then before I move into some demographic stats, I did think it was interesting to see that if we talk about traditional genre fiction, so mystery, SFF, romance, like Western, whatever, like things that are kind of derided as being just genre fiction, that constitutes 58% of my favorites. So 42% are non-genre books, so like literary fiction, classics, nonfiction, etc. But it definitely is weighted towards what is often considered lighter kind of books. So I don't know. You guys know how I feel about people poo-pooing things that are considered to be lowbrow. Lowbrow things can still be very high quality, even if they're not attempting a more artistic tone. So anyway, I thought that was also an interesting little nugget. And then getting into some of the demographic things, I looked at 3 elements that I thought I could get at pretty easily. So one, in terms of white versus non-white authors, I guess I was really on these only looking at authors and not characters. 76% of these books were by what I believe are white authors, and 24% were by what I believe are non-white authors, which makes sense, especially frankly given the fact that I do have a very big chunk in here of books from the English-speaking literary canon that definitely tends to skew towards more non-BIPOC authors. So I thought that was interesting. I thought it was interesting to see that of my favorites, there's a much higher proportion that are men than what I tend to see in my yearly stats at this point. So 36% of the authors of my favorite books were men and 64% were women. In my general reading, I would say that's much closer to like 80% of the books I read are by women. So I thought that was kind of interesting. And then the other thing that sort of surprised me was the nationality breakdown. So American authors dominate my favorites at I think 48%. Also, honestly, that was a little higher than I expected. I expected there to be even more British authors, which were only 34%. But the third most frequent nationality of my favorite author list was New Zealand, Kiwis. And actually even more so if we also included Australia in there, that would be like 10% are from Australia or New Zealand. So I thought that was interesting. And I should mention the German and Russian folks in this list all eventually immigrated to the US, so you could have broken those out as also being American, so just a side note there. But anyway, I thought that surprised me a little bit. I didn't realize I had so much representative from New Zealand, so there you go. But anyway, without further ado, let's transition into the books themselves. So these are my top 50 unranked books. Just want to reiterate that they are unranked. And I do also want to acknowledge, I think there's somewhat of a recency bias in terms of books that I've read more recently are just higher up in my mind. So I'm sure that that is also impacting the overall pool of books that are reflected here, but such is life. A Good Man is Hard to Find by Flannery O'Connor. A Kiss for Midwinter by Courtney Milan. A Week to Be Wicked by Tessa Dare. Act Like It by Lucy Parker. All Systems Red by Martha Wells. All the President's Men by Carl Bernstein and Bob Woodward. And Then There Were None by Agatha Christie. Aidi by Roxane Gay. Beauty and the Billionaire by Jessica Clare. Black Reconstruction in America by W.E.B. Du Bois. Black Sun by Rebecca Roanhorse. Cards on the Table by Agatha Christie. The Collected Short Stories of Sherlock Holmes by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. Crooked House by Agatha Christie. Death on the Nile by Agatha Christie. Devi's Distraction by Ruby Dixon. Eichmann in Jerusalem by Hannah Arendt. Gilead by Marilyn Robinson. Heart of Obsidian by Nalini Singh. Hunger by Roxane Gay. Johannes Cabal the Detective by Jonathan L. Howard. Killer Instinct by Jennifer Lynn Barnes. Kiss of Snow by Nalini Singh. Magic Breaks by Alona Andrews. Murder on the Orient Express by Agatha Christie. My Life in France by Julia Child. Percy Jackson and the Last Olympian by Rick Riordan. Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen. Rock Hard by Nalini Singh. Sources of the Self by Charles Taylor. Stamped from the Beginning by Ibram X. Kendi. Take a Hint, Danny Brown by Talia Hibbert. The Beast's Bride by Jill Miles. The Big Short by Michael Lewis. The Bloody Chamber by Angela Carter. The End of the Affair by Graham Greene. The Haunting of Hill House by Shirley Jackson. The Library at Mount Char by Scott Hawkins. The Lord of the Rings by J.R.R. Tolkien. The Merchant of Venice by William Shakespeare. The Most of P.G. Wodehouse by P.G. Wodehouse. The Obsession by Nora Roberts. The Picture of Dorian Gray by Oscar Wilde. The Remains of the Day by Kazuo Ishiguro. The Rook by Daniel O'Malley. The Wall of Winnipeg and Me by Mariana Zapata. The Woman in White by Wilkie Collins. Treachery and Death by J.D. Robb. Why We Get Fat by Gary Taubes. Wildfire by Alona Andrews. So that was my list of my unranked top 50 favorite books of all time, at least as of 2021. Definitely let me know what you thought of this list, if any of them are also on your favorite list, and let me know if this is something you'd be interested in seeing me do for my top 100 books next year, because I think that might be the direction that I go in. So with that being said, I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you did, please like, subscribe, follow me on the social medias if you are so inclined. I have all that information linked in the description box below. And I think that will do it. I hope you're having an absolutely lovely day today, and I will just talk to you soon. Bye!